listening to Talking Law, the podcast where business owners just like you discover how to avoid legal landmines and build value using smart legal tips. Join your host, Joanna Oakey, as she cuts through the legal jargon and gives you clear and simple, actionable legal strategies, which will get you optimal business results.
Hi, it's Joanna Oakey here and welcome back to Talking Law, a podcast proudly brought to you by our commercial legal practice, Aspect Legal. Now, today we have on the show Rod Hore from HHMC Global to talk to us all about using shares as a talent retention strategy in professional service businesses. Now, I always love discussions with Rod. In fact, Rod has been a serial guest on both Talking Law and our sister podcast, the Deal Room podcast, because really he has so much to share. Being a 40-year veteran of Australian and international IT and corporate advisory organisations, who was a whiz at advisory services for mergers and acquisitions, but also in assisting businesses and in particular recruitment businesses in the management of their business and also the preparation for sale. Now, in this episode, as I said, we are really digging into this topic of using shares as a talent retention strategy, which is particularly relevant for professional service businesses, but also perhaps more broadly as well. And so in this episode, we're digging into shares retention strategy, the alternative to shares, preparing for new shareholders, becoming more corporate, and arranging the wedding and planning the divorce shareholders agreements. So buckle in, here we go for our discussion with Rod Hore from HHMC Global. Welcome back to Talking Law, Rod. It's so good to have you on the show again.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Nice to be here again. And we always find interesting topics to talk about, which is great.
We do. And today, of course, we're talking about using shares as a talent retention strategy in professional services businesses. Now, this is something that, I mean, there's nothing new about it. Of course, it's something that's been around for a very long period of time. But it's a topic that is actually coming up a lot in our clients and in I think just general discussion at the moment for business. So what's your perspective on it?
Well, it certainly is coming up in conversation a lot more, and maybe some of the deep thinking that's gone on over the pandemic period has helped that process. People have been very concerned about retention and keeping their best people and all of those topics, and so therefore the shares conversation comes up. And there's probably two things that always struck me about this. One is the implications of that. What does an organisation have to do? And you did a very, very good podcast just recently. I even wrote down episode 168, which was talking about shareholders agreements. And so that prompted a few things in my mind as well. But when we get involved in the conversations, and it's these small to medium services-based organisations where the staff are the asset of the organisation, and we mostly work in recruitment, but I think this applies to all of those services type organisations. There's not a lot of knowledge about it, and most of the people who are considering bringing in new shareholders or changing their shareholder structure are doing it for the first time, and they don't have much experience about it. And so they tend to ask their mates what's going on. It tends to become a pub conversation. What are you doing, and how are you going about this? And the guy at the pub always says, "Oh, give your staff shares and they'll never leave." So, there's a bit more to it than that. And I think people need to think about some options. And if they do decide to go down that path, then there's a whole range of work that they need to do. And maybe we can talk about some of that today.
Yeah, but I guess it is good to come back to this focus of the pub talk, as you say. Number one, it's recognising that as employers, there is a need to think clearly about your retention strategy. So that's the first thing.
Yes.
Number two, it's that having employees holding equity can sometimes be a very positive thing for the business. So I think that's it's probably implicit in what we're talking about today. But I just wanted to talk about that really really briefly in terms of what both of our experiences have been in seeing the benefits, but also perhaps in seeing some of the downsides as well. So from my own perspective, I think, when employees have equity, suddenly their approach to a business can change. And it's fascinating to see that change from employee to owner mindset, and it's lovely watching that sometimes. And I think that's a positive. And certainly also just one thing to throw in there from a succession perspective as well. It's a great way to start to build that succession plan for the future, to be lining people up. Number one, maybe who might be ultimate owners, but number two, who will help contribute to the longevity of the staff connection to the business as a whole for someone else who's coming in to buy shares within a business. So there's some positives, right?
Yeah, no, look, there's absolutely some positives, but it's not for everybody. And so, just in terms of, so first of all, it's not the only strategy. I mean, you can do things like profit share, and you can do things like other activities to encourage people and make them feel like they're part of the process, and to give them some growth opportunities and so on. I mean, shares is not the only option.
Yeah.
But the second thing is that if you are going to give shares, I'll never use that word again. If you are going to get shareholders into your organisation, you do need to make sure that from a personal perspective, from the founder's perspective, whether that's one or more, that's actually really what you want to do, because it changes the nature of the organisation. If you're running a little family lifestyle business and you bring a shareholder in, you've got all sorts of obligations that you probably didn't want to inherit. If you're running a bigger organisation where you're aiming for a trade sale, maybe that's a little bit of an impediment. We can talk about that. Or maybe that's a benefit, So is it the style of business where you're looking for that potential succession planning or MBO type arrangement, or are you looking for something else? You've got to know yourself and have your own thoughts clear before you go down this path.
Yeah.
But when it works, when all the dots line up, it is a great option, and there can be many, many benefits.
And maybe let's also just very quickly talk about the flip side as well. What are some of the downsides that you've seen? Can you think of any particular examples? I'm thinking of one, I have to admit, right at the moment, of a client who came to us just last week, who had given, and I think in this case they had given shares to a staff member, an employee, and then things turned sour, as happens, and they didn't have any clarity in the shareholders agreement about what exit would look like. So when it came to the point of, the employee moved on, they still had the shares. And so the issue then was, well, how do we get the shares back? And then there's this whole battle going on at the moment in relation to what does that look like? What is the value of the shares? And of course, from an employee perspective as well, that can be a massive issue. And of course, there's ways that we can deal with that if you have protected it from the beginning. But there's so often the case that business owners haven't thought about the exit or the end, when they're setting up the beginning. So what about you, Rod? What have you seen?
Look, I see that as well. And I think, the first thing that we talk to people about is, are they prepared for the big step up in corporate responsibility? Mm-hmm. So you can be pretty relaxed as a small to medium business, and in terms of how you do things, personal expenses and how you communicate to the shareholders and all of those sorts of things can be very, very relaxed. But if you want to bring now a new shareholder in who's not a founder of the business, maybe not a member of the family, all of those sorts of things, then all of a sudden you've got to actually clean up yourself a little bit, because and as a matter of fact, we even have a checklist for this because we talk about it so often. So, for example, we'd recommend that everybody has an employment contract. That sounds like a strange thing to start with, but you want to be able to measure people's performance. You want to be able to take action if they're not performing. And the fact that they're a shareholder shouldn't prevent those things from happening. Quite often, if there's a group of founders in a small to medium business, they don't have employment contracts because they've never got around to it. Yes. You probably need to take your personal expenses out of the books. You probably need to report the financials a little more diligently than you do at the moment. You certainly have to think about dividends and all of those components because now there's other shareholders to consider. So that requires some pre-thought, and some business owners may not want to do that in the future, and that's a justified decision. But if they are going to bring in shareholders, they need to be protected by their legal rights, and you've got to treat them appropriately. And so you've got to do all of the right things. And that's before we talk about shareholders' agreements and the divorce scenarios.
Yeah. Okay, all right. So we've talked about, I guess, the positives and the general body of risk in using shares as a retention strategy. So, and we've talked very briefly about the alternatives, but maybe we just dig into that briefly more. The alternatives to shares, we talked about setting up bonuses and incentives based on the performance of the business without actually giving equity.
Yeah.
And bearing in mind, sometimes you may think that what employees want is equity, but that can sometimes be a concerning thing for employees, and you may not even realise this, perhaps with your entrepreneurial hat on, where you may see business ownership as a really positive thing. Sometimes employees don't necessarily view it with the same lens. And whilst they're happy to look at the upside of participating in a portion of the profit, they can be fearful about, holding shares that may not be liquid for them.
Yes.
They may have difficulty selling ultimately and transferring into a value.
Or they just may not understand it and therefore run away from it because it's something that's not understood. And look, you may think you know your staff very well, but this is a different conversation to have with them. So what you talk to them about their skills and their ability to do their current role and their job aspirations, it's entirely different when you're now starting to talk to them about their propensity for risk, their wealth creation plans, what their partner thinks of this. All of those sorts of things come into it because it's an entirely different conversation. And it might be that they actually don't want shares. They might actually be able to be, satisfied at work. He's Rod waving his hands and putting quotes around that, by doing things like participating in as part of the executive team. They want more responsibility and more say in the business, but they don't necessarily want to be an owner of the business. Or maybe you can find special strategic projects for them to do in addition to their job because they're ready for more things to do. But they don't necessarily need shares. So unless you investigate that, you'll never know. But it's sort of a hammer and nail opportunity when you're starting to talk about shares. You need to very carefully get to know your staff, your senior staff, what's going to motivate them to stay in the organisation and to be fulfilled, and then how can you satisfy that?
Yeah. So perhaps some initial discussions where you're actually
Absolutely.
really, you're talking and you're listening and hearing what it is that your employees really are after. What do they want?
And so for many of them, just like, by the way, for a lot of the founders who went and started up a business, it's the first time they've stopped being executing their trade, if I can use that bad analogy, of working in their industry as a professional to now starting to think about business ownership issues. And so just because you've been through that as a founder over the last X number of years, it doesn't mean your staff don't also have those issues, and maybe this is the first time they've had to think about it. So you can't jump in and make people or assume people are going to go for it or make a decision very quickly. They need to be gently brought along on that path if that's what they want to do.
Brilliant. Love it. Okay, so now we should probably perhaps move on to how is it that we prepare a business for new shareholders? What's your perspective on this?
In some ways, you've got to do all the boring stuff first, because you've got to be very, very clear that this is the right step for your organisation and for the existing shareholders of the organisation in terms of where they want it to go forward. So, is your vision of where the organisation is going to be in the future, is your plans, and that's personal as well as business plans. Does this match it? Okay, so if you get that right and you say, yes, this is a path we want to go down, and you might spend a few months actually getting some advice and talking about that and everything, then don't spring it on your staff, as I just said. You've actually then got to broach the idea with them and bring them along gently. So there's the whole internal process of getting people's minds and in order and educated so that they understand what the opportunity is and what the potential of the opportunity is and why they're being asked and how this might impact them going forward. Then you've got all the technical components to do. So we talked about becoming more corporate. So getting your house in order so that you can actually handle this better, starting to get some legal advice, starting to get some advice about all of the scenarios out in the future that you really should cover off now when it's easier to cover them off. So that you can bring people in, you can get people out. What do you need to do for that? You need to have valuations and all of the components of that. You'd certainly need to have a shareholders agreement, and we could talk about that again because I think that's really, really important. It is such an important business document.
It really is. And maybe we'll talk soon about why some of the difficulties, I guess, in setting a shareholders agreement up are the reasons why quite often shareholders agreements aren't in place. The problem is if it's hard at the beginning, if it feels hard at the beginning to set it up, I tell you what, you can't even guess how much harder it is to deal with.
Exponentially harder.
Where, when parties aren't agreeing, because generally right at the beginning, everyone's singing from the same hymn book, but setting shareholders agreements up really help you to ask those questions that need to be asked along the way. And we'll talk a little bit about thinking about exit soon. But one thing that I just wanted to throw in, we're talking about shares here, but the other way, I guess, to organise this, and it's important that we remind our listeners, sometimes it doesn't have to be the issue of shares, but it might be options for shares later on down the track. And the difference there is shares is something that you can either issue them right now and they might be purchased now. There might be a purchase price that is deferred or paid over time, but there could also be options. So it could be done on the basis of certain triggers or performances, KPIs being met. And sometimes that can be a softer way to enter into this sort of, you still need to think about your shareholders agreement from the beginning, but it perhaps is a way to bridge this gap sometimes between where the employee feels they are right now to sort of softly bring them along over time. They have this option, whether they pay for the option or they're given the option for the future exercise on the basis of the their performance over time. So that can be a way to help bring them mentally along. I think that, that can be a good strategy.
We've also seen a lot of what I call phantom shares or golden handcuffs, where people are saying, hey, we're a pretty small business. I plan to sell in the next 3 years or whatever it may be, that you sit and expose to your staff. I really want you to be part of it, and I want you to be rewarded when we sell the business. So I'm going to give you a legal document that says if I sell the business, then I will pay you X% of the sale price. And so, you're incentivizing the staff to stay with you for that period. You're not giving them anything in the short term, but you're creating a proper obligation that if you go down a sale path, you'll actually share the rewards of that.
Yeah, and I've seen this done really well a few times. In fact, in a transaction we have worked on together, Rod. I'm not sure if you recall it many years ago, but certainly I've seen this used really cleverly as a way for employees to really, and if we're going to start, we may as well throw in here, I think this dovetails well into this concept of exit, because there's quite often I find with business owners this real confusion about when and how they communicate to their staff that they're looking at exit. And in fact, bringing the staff along with them in terms of giving them some sort of uplift or benefit from, preparing the business for sale and then ultimately the sale of the business is actually, can be a wonderful way to bridge that communication gap as well, right?
It can. I mean, it puts all sorts of things on the table that normally are not discussed and not shared, and it does add to it. I'll give you an example. My brother is actually retiring next month from an architectural firm as a managing director of an architectural firm. And he's the second generation of that architectural firm, not from our family, but he bought into it, became the CEO of that organisation. And he's passing the baton on to the next generation. And that's fascinating. And it's been really interesting for me to observe that from the outside, because this was an organisation where, the process of shareholding and of regeneration of the organisation and so on is defined in the culture of the organisation. That's how they do it. And yet it took years to bring the next level up to the point where they could actually take on that responsibility and do the purchase of the shares and accept the responsibility of the leadership roles and all of those sorts of things. So, again, it's just re-emphasised in my mind that, all of these processes, you can't make assumptions about the people. You've actually got to put in place programs to get them to where you want them to be.
Yeah, brilliant. I absolutely love it. So, of course, the question of the valuation or the value of the shares, whether they're shares or options, however we're approaching it, is something that is quite often, I think, mulled over by employers who are looking at this, owners of a business who are looking at this as a strategy. What's your perspective? And I guess to be clear about it, many times business owners will consider gifting versus selling. Gifting, selling at a discount, selling at the actual price. From an option perspective, is there an option fee? And when the option is due to be exercised, what's the price for that? So there's lots of pricing considerations. Where do you sit in this, Rod?
Okay, so I think that the founders of the business have taken all the risk and put in all the hard work to get something from zero to something. And so as long as we're not talking about the first 2 or 3 years of the operation of the business, but beyond that, I think that you should never give away shares. That's sort of a personal philosophy of mine, because I think the incoming people need to understand the risk and effort that has gone to get the business where it is today, and they need to pay for that, even if it's a generous payment in terms of its valuation. But they need to understand that there's a value to the business, and then the goal to go forward is to actually raise the value of that business. And I also think it means that people will treat it exceptionally seriously, because it's possibly the first time they've had to go out and either raise a loan or put some, do something to actually purchase into a business like this. And so it adds to the conversation incredibly.
I think that's a really good point. I actually had this discussion yesterday with an employee of a practice who came to me and said that he had been offered shares, and so he was looking at taking this option as opposed to another option that he had on the table somewhere else for the acquisition of a business. But he looked at it with a bit of skepticism, I think, because there was no value that was attributed to the shares that he was being offered. And I thought, that's quite interesting, isn't it? And we talked about managing risk in the situation, the different ways to deal with it. But I just thought it's really interesting, because I can understand where the owner was probably coming from, yes, in feeling that it made sense, to take away any of the hesitation of an employee to holding the shares, so they're getting the benefit of skin in the game of their employees, but taking out that decision-making process. But the funny thing was, in this situation, it can create the flip side, which is this. Yes. This feeling, there's something right. Yeah, there's something wrong here. What's going on?
And look, you can do all sorts of things. You can do things like give them a new title, give them a slight pay rise, and the value of that pay rise will pay for the loan they need to go and get out to buy the shares or something. I mean, so you can fiddle the books any way you want to, but you've got to make a responsibility on the person coming in, because I think they'll treat it with such greater respect.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so shares should not be gifted. We've covered off here. But I like some of the creative ways that you've suggested, Rod, how we can deal with that. What are the other things that we should think about in preparing new shareholders? Obviously, we talked about the need to get some of your legals in line initially. And I think as a whole, cleaning up the business, making sure it's got, proper foundations in place, because you're going to have, a view. I guess you're starting to look at the business from a more professional, standing back, an objective viewpoint than you as you and your business merged into one, which is, even if it's you with other partners, quite often there is this merging of identity.
It is, and it becomes a club, and that's very hard to break that club. So one of the challenges we see when we go into growing businesses is that the founders are the executive team, and they are the legal directors, and they are the shareholders. And it's impossible for anybody in the organisation to actually have equal standing in terms of sitting with them as the executive, because they know that they're not. And so you've got to actually work consciously, and employment contracts are part of that process of breaking all that up so that you only, well, here's the Rod's view of this. Okay, 95% of the time you think you're part of the executive team, and you act as though you're part of the executive team. And if there's other members you want as part of the executive team, you treat them equally and you treat them with respect. About 5% of the time you treat yourself as a legal director, okay? And you have separate meetings for that with a separate agenda, and you only talk about issues that are appropriate for being a legal director. And you never, ever, ever talk at business about being a shareholder. That's what you talk to your partner at home about. And so the worst possible scenario is somebody walking into the organisation and say, I told you I wanted that done, and I'm a shareholder here, and you've got to do it my way. And that is, you're not building a team there. You're not building an organisation at that point. But when you've got this group of people who've worked very hard and founded the organisation and have taken it forward, it's actually, they've got to consciously work at breaking that up. But they'll never get people rising in the organisation if they don't break it up. And if they have challenges on the downside, where some of those original founders now start to change their mind about how hard they want to work, or whether they're performing, or some other issue, then that also creates problems, because they probably don't have the mechanisms to be able to deal with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. So we've talked about generally shares as a retention strategy. We've talked about the alternatives. We've talked about preparing for new shareholders. So what are the other elements that you think employers, business owners perhaps don't understand about this area and should be alert to?
Well, things certainly becoming more corporate is actually not to be undertaken lightly. So there's really two components to this, isn't it? Is that do your homework and make sure that as a corporate organisation, or as an organisation, you're prepared to go down this path, but then understand all the things you've got to change to enable that to be successful. So, executive team, legal directors, shareholders is one issue, but all of those things about how the finances are managed and all of that. So all of that component, and that's got to be done in conjunction with bringing the people along on a process so that they're ready to become shareholders, and they're ready to become more involved with the business and part of the business in a different way. So both components of that need to be worked on. And if you don't do that, you can just run into all sorts of problems. And I suppose I'll move along, because I think all of that then becomes the discussion about how you're going to run the business going forward, and therefore you're now starting to talk about the shareholders agreement, because there will be many fallacies and many misunderstandings and much pub talk about what becoming a shareholder really means. And the shareholders agreement is where you sort that out, and it's a unique arrangement between the shareholders for that organisation. So it is a negotiated outcome. It is a way that you want to work, and it's a lot of discussion is required. We encourage people, and I'm sure you do as well, to have all of those conversations when everybody's feeling very red-cheeked and rosy with each other.
Yes.
So while you're arranging the wedding, actually plan the divorce is our advice.
And I think that's such an important point, because as we were talking about earlier, today in this discussion, we ran this webinar the other day and polled the attendees, and we were talking about shareholders agreements, and polled the shareholders on how many attendees had shareholders agreements already in their business, how many didn't. How many had a shareholders agreement, but it was in draft and not signed? And the reason I was interested in that, and the answer was around about 30 to 40% of the people who were on the call, admitted to the fact that they'd started the process but not finished it. So there's two components to this. There's starting the process, there's finishing the process, actually finalising and agreeing and signing it off, and then there's also making sure it stays current to where you are in the business today. But I must say, so firstly, there is a massive number of, new clients who come into us who are suffering some sort of dispute, whether or not that's an issue at exit or an issue with a current business partner, other shareholder, whatever, and they don't have in place a shareholders agreement. So that's the first thing. When you don't have something in place, then the problem is, how is it that you will navigate that agreement? How will you deal with that now when there's already animosity? And it's very difficult to do that. And the reason why quite often shareholders agreements aren't in place at the beginning is because the discussions can feel a little bit difficult, but they're so much more difficult when there's animosity than right at the beginning when you're all on the same page. And I see shareholders agreements as that opportunity to ask the questions you should be answering right at the beginning.
Well, I think they're very difficult, and I think you need an external person in the room, because the external person has no skin in the game and can ask all the really dumb questions that everybody else is afraid to ask. Well, they're not so dumb, are they? Because they need to be asked.
Yeah.
But the hard questions maybe, like, and some really basic stuff that probably people don't think about ahead of time. So if somebody dies, are their shares now part of, do they get willed through to the estate, or do they get bought back by the business? Do we want an unknown external shareholder in the business, or are we going to do something about that? So all of those conversations, or what happens if a person underperforms and has to be sacked out of the business? Are they allowed to keep their shares? So they're really, really interesting discussions that would not happen unless somebody is actually coordinating that and structuring that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's great when we get involved in that, because we think we add an incredible amount of value and cover a whole bunch of territory in a very short amount of time, and it prevents some of those problems out into the future.
I wholeheartedly agree with you, Rod, because this is where, obviously there's a lot of things from a legal perspective you have to get organised, but a lot of what you're deciding also comes back to questions that are a lot bigger than just, the legal answer, the choices that you're making from a legal perspective. And I think the idea of having someone sit with you and work you through the bigger extensions of the questions that you're dealing with is such an important point. So how is it that you work with clients in this process? What do you find works best?
Within our specialisation, which is the recruitment industry, there's literally thousands of small to medium businesses, and most of the business owners are approaching all of the business components of running a business for the first time. They're great recruiters, but they're running the business component for the first time. And so we assist them with general advisory work when they ring up with a question. We do a lot of valuations, and that often gets involved into this conversation. And because we get asked it so often, we now have a bit of a process to take organisations through not only getting those founders organised about what the implications are of what they're about to do, but working with the internal staff who are thinking about or are about to be offered to come up and maybe be a shareholder and be part of the executive team. And so depending on the scenarios, we might have a fairly light touch, or we might be very deeply involved with them while they go through this transition process. One of the things we do, by the way, is we like to have what I call the business component of the shareholders agreement nutted out. But we're not lawyers, so we then hand it over to a lawyer and say, okay, now we need to turn this into a proper shareholders agreement and make it a legal document.
Love it. Absolutely love it. And of course, I guess from our perspective, the things that we're really thinking about from a legal perspective relate to how decisions made, what's your expectations between the shareholders in relation to what you're expecting each will contribute or won't contribute, because I often find that can create simmering issues over time when perhaps there's, a not clearly communicated expectation between each of the shareholders as to what each other will do. And of course, exit. And I'd really like to come back and have you back on our podcast to talk about how this links into exit as well, because there's some really critical components. There's some critical components of a shareholders agreement that link to, well, what does this look like at exit and how might the decisions you're making today impact you at exit? Yeah. But there's also a lot of, I guess, deeper discussion as well. So I'd love to have you back on the show, Rod. But one of the things that I'd like to point out today as well is that Rod and I will be running a webinar that is specifically focused on this topic. So check out the show notes for details on the webinar so that you can register. And no fear, if you're watching this and the webinar has already passed, you'll find ways in the show notes of also being able to get in and to have a look at that replay. But I just want to say a massive thank you, Rod, for coming onto the podcast today. And maybe if you can share with our listeners how they can contact you at HHMC if they're interested in getting assistance going through this process.
Yeah, look, our website's easy to find, hhmc.com.au. All the contact details there. I'd love to have an initial conversation with you and see if we can help.
Brilliant. Okay, wonderful. Well, Rod, thank you so much, as always, for coming onto the show. I'm really looking forward to the webinar that we're about to run on this topic, and looking forward to have you back so we can dig into exit a little bit more.
Thanks so much, Joanna.
Well, that's it for this episode of Talking Law. Just as a quick recap, of course, today we were talking all about using shares as a talent retention strategy, particularly relevant to recruitment businesses and other professional service businesses, but also more broadly relevant to businesses where talent retention is really important. And in fact, that could be said to be almost any business. I hope you found the information that we covered today useful. And if you'd like more information about this topic, then just head over to our website at www.talkinglaw.com.au, where we have the transcript available for free download. And there, through that website and also through the show notes, you'll also be able to find out how to contact Rod Hore at HHMC Global if you would like someone to walk this decision plank with you and help line you up in the best possible way for using shares as a talent retention strategy. He works particularly with recruitment businesses. And also, if you are looking at setting up this sort of strategy within your organisation, then you'll want to make sure that the legals are aligned closely. So in order to do that, head over to our website or the show notes to find out how to contact our lawyers at Aspect Legal if you or your clients would like any assistance with setting up the legal documentation to set this up, and of course the shareholders agreements that are critically important along the way. And finally, if you enjoyed what you heard today, then please pop over to iTunes, make sure you press subscribe on your favourite podcast player and leave us a review. Now, if you're really interested in this topic, don't forget we have another episode similar to this. It's really the extension of this topic, really about how using shares as a talent retention strategy can impact you in building for an exit. We have this on our sister podcast, the Deal Room podcast. So if you're interested in hearing more about this topic and the connection to this as an exit strategy or connection of this whole topic to how it might impact your business at exit, then head over to the Deal Room podcast. And of course, in our show notes, we'll actually link through to that episode as well. Well, that's it. Thank you for listening in. You have been listening to Joanna Oakey and Talking Law, a podcast proudly brought to you by our commercial legal practice, Aspect Legal. See you next time. If you'd like to find out more about how to add value to your business through employee share schemes, then make sure you register for our upcoming webinar where Rod Hore and I talk about employee shares. We talk about matching share plans with strategic objectives, understanding the pros and cons, getting the structure right, critical background work, and lots of implementation tips and tricks. So please make sure you hit the registration link in our show notes or over at our website, talkinglaw.com.au. And there, if you have missed the webinar, you'll also find details of how you can catch up into the future and get a copy of the on-demand version. Are you looking for a top quality legal team to assist you in your organisation? Aspect Legal is an innovative commercial legal practice that specialises in providing fast and professional services for their clients. If you'd like to chat about how we might be able to assist you, simply head over to our website at aspectlegal.com.au to book in a time for a free discussion with one of our lawyers.
Thanks for listening to Talking Law. Tune in next time for more smart legal tips and tricks to keep you clear of those legal landmines. If you want to get a download of today's show notes, head over to talkinglaw.com.au. Information in this podcast is general in nature, not legal advice. If you want advice for your business, visit talkinglaw.com.au.